Welcome to Buddha at the Gas Pump. My name is Rick Archer, and I'm out at the Science and Non-Duality Conference in San Jose, California, with some friends, with a lot of friends, but at the moment I have three: Sally Kempton, Igor Kufayev, and Manas Kafatos. And the reason I assembled this little conversation that we're about to have is that a question always rumbles around in my brain, which is, I'll articulate it as best as possible. If consciousness is the ultimate reality, and if there is an ultimate reality, then everything must actually be that reality. If we take this glass and we start to go more and more microscopically, we get down to the point at which there is no glass, and if we go far enough, we get down to the point at which what we find is what we find if we do that with anything in creation. So, is there really a glass? Or is there only that which we find when we get right down to the real nitty-gritty? And if that is the case, then how do glasses and tables and palm trees and buildings and people appear? What creates, is it an illusion that we're seeing all these things? So anyway, I could elaborate on that, but I got to talking with Igor about this, and he said, well, you know, Kashmir Shaivism addresses this very beautifully, and perhaps we could have a little panel discussion when we get out there in which we'll discuss this in light of, or with reference to, Kashmir Shaivism. And so these three panelists came to mind. Sally and Sally and Menas were both students of Swami Muktananda, and I believe that Kashmir Shaivism was very much the foundation of his tradition. And Igor was not, but is somewhat of an expert in that field as well. So I thought it would be very interesting to have this conversation. And it's not something that was being done within the context of the formal conference, so we just set it up on the side. So I'd like to just introduce the guests. Or actually, I think I'll have you guys introduce yourselves just briefly, because that'll be more effective than my introducing you. Why don't we do that, starting with Sally?
I'm Sally Kempton, and I'm a spiritual teacher. I'm a writer. I've written a couple of books on meditation and on Shakti. I was a longtime student of Swami Muktananda, who actually introduced me to Kashmir Shaivism in the very early 1970s. And before that, I was a journalist. I teach workshops, retreats, teleclasses in what I call non-dual contemplative devotional tantra, because the tradition that I was trained in and that I relate to is kind of combines the understanding of non-duality with the recognition of the gift of devotion and the understanding that love, devotion is an aspect of Shakti, which is an aspect of reality, which is one of the heart teachings of Kashmir Shaivism.
Good. Igor?
I'm Shiva. I'm Igor Kufayev. I was born in Uzbekistan, and essentially I was an artist as far back as I can remember myself. Quite a few things have happened in between, realizing that I'm that, and one without a second. But to give like a kind of a little bit more a linear perspective, I've been studying art and pursuing it all my life, where the kind of drive was realized that beneath that, the drive for art was actually very, very much a powerful, energetic movement within that was kind of like eager to express itself. As soon as I realized that, I've realized that art is actually secondary, but what is primal is that drive for self-actualization. So in the meantime, of course, I did a lot of studies, and I was at some point a student at St. Petersburg Academy of Fine Arts. In my early 20s, I moved to Warsaw, which was my first kind of formative years as an independent artist. And since 1991, I was a resident of London and pursued artistic career in arts as a painter, until a powerful transformation took place around my mid-30s, which essentially made me realize that there is nothing to pursue other than that which I am already as an embodied being. So in no time, which took quite a few years, I find myself teaching and essentially sharing this knowledge. So that's pretty much the story.
Thanks. Menas?
Thank you for the invitation. Minas Kafatos. I'm a quantum physicist teaching at Chapman University and other places. But in any case, have been a student of Shavit since 1980 when I met Baba Mukhananda in South Fallsburg, New York. In fact, I remember Sally in those days. And certainly in 1980, a big transformation took place. And since then, my life has changed quite a lot. I can see the dramatic and the subtle changes. The subtle changes are actually perhaps even more profound. I'm also an artist. I started art in Greece.
Right.
But 14 years old, I told my dad, you know, art is so easy for me, I would like to go to science. So I decided to go into astrophysics first and then eventually into quantum physics. The exciting part now is that we have actually mathematical ways, mathematical tools to get us as close as possible to the top 5 tattvas. So I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that. But realize that mathematics itself comes from the underlying sea of consciousness. But it is the most fundamental way to get as close as possible to universal consciousness, and we can talk a bit more about some of the specifics of these steps of transformation in human lives, and also how the universal Shakti gives rise to the universe.
Yeah, I think you were addressing that in your talk last night at the conference, and you were saying something along the lines of what I was talking about with the glass, and you used the word veiling. So I got the understanding from listening to you that there's some sort of veiling process that occurs in order for apparent forms to arise.
Correct. And again, from quantum physics today, we know that non-locality is a fundamental property of the universe. In fact, it is perhaps the most fundamental property of the universe. I describe it in the non-local universe, which, as you know, it's one of my books. So if that's the case, and we're entangled, which is the theme of this conference here, then how come a glass appears as a glass, and you know, Sally and Igor and you and myself look as separate beings? Something must happen, and the great Shaivite text, all of them, but let's say the Pratya Vinija Hridaya, which is the text of self-recognition, written by Kshamaraja, sort of actually gives the steps of how universal consciousness becomes the bound soul, let's put it that way, the individual self. And crucial to that is the principle of veiling, which in Sanskrit is called Maya. And it's a term that sometimes is quite misunderstood, because Maya herself is misunderstood. It's really the great power of the Lord to veil herself or veil himself. Of course, the Lord is not, does not have a gender. And appear as multiplicity of universes and objects. The interesting thing now is that quantum theory, something that has come up lately, is that, and this is why the mathematics is important, we find that we have a similar concept that we call veiled non-locality. And Subhash Kak, you may know him, is also, he's actually from Kashmir himself, he knows about Shaivas quite a bit. And I have written a couple of articles. And basically there we look at this principle of veiling purely from the point of view of quantum physics. And it seems that general relativity and quantum theory come together. And the consciousness seems to be an important part of that. Without it, veiling does not make any sense. And so it's quite exciting, because now perhaps we have a way to talk about the unification of physics from the point of view of this veiling, which is analog to what the great Shaivite masters were calling the Maya, and of course the Vedantists were calling Maya.
Do either of you want to comment? Yeah.
Well, I would say one of the earmarks, hallmarks of Shaivism, of Kashmir Shaivism, of non-dual Shaivism, as opposed to non-dual Vedanta,
Right.
which is, of course, is very similar to it, is the understanding about Maya, about the veiling power. So in Vedanta, where the teaching is that ultimate reality is the only real truth, and that the world is illusion, Maya is considered this kind of mistake, or the straw in the glass that makes us think that the water is two when actually it's one. Whereas in Kashmir Shaivism, Maya is seen as a level of manifestation of Shakti, which is the power aspect of the ultimate reality. That really she manifests as Maya in order to veil unity, so as to play in manifestation. And the sort of essential thing about Tantric Shaivism is this understanding that the world is real, even though it dissolves in certain states of consciousness, because Shakti, the love, bliss, energy of the divine, is present in every particle. So as you were saying last night, it's empty and it's also full. It's without any form, without ultimate reality, and yet it is totally full of ultimate reality. And that's Shaivism is really, I think, the only tradition that really explains this that gives you permission, so to speak, to be a serious spiritual seeker and fully in love with the physical world, which is why I think it works so well with quantum physics.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I may add what Sally said, precisely point, and in terms of course, I believe when you start getting deeper into Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta, then you begin to see that actually he was also talking about the same thing. He was. But then he was misunderstood, and this is a problem with the words. This is a problem with what again the great Shaivite masters call the limitation, the limiting power of the words, the Madhika Shakti. And of course that's what makes us as human beings, and we get bound by our minds and by our own words. And so ultimately Vedanta and Shaivism are not really opposite, but Shaivism is much more down to earth in terms of everyday life, in terms of science. That's why we scientists really tend to gravitate towards it, because it accepts the world as real rather than what the interpretation of some of the Advaita Vedantic teachings ended up saying that the world is not real. And then, of course, the reaction of scientists is, what do you mean it's not real? Then you're denying science. Right. So rather than have to explain all of that that's not really what Shankara meant, then, just go with Shaivism.
Well, as human beings, we have a certain sensory capacity or a certain range within which we can perceive, right? And, we don't perceive magnetic fields, we don't perceive ultraviolet, we perceive within a certain range. And so, and also in terms of macroscopic and microscopic, we have certain capacity to perceive. Now, if, let's say, I had superpowers and could perceive more and more microscopically what this glass really is, then at a certain point there wouldn't be glass, at a certain point there wouldn't be molecules, at a certain point there wouldn't be atoms. As I go deeper and deeper, those more manifest levels would no longer be found. And at a certain point there wouldn't be anything that could be called a thing, right? I mean, are you with me so far? Yes. I'm not speaking incorrectly in terms of physics. No. And so, just because I have, limited perceptual capacity as a human being, it seems like I see this glass as a glass because I have limited perceptual abilities. If I had superpower perceptual abilities, I could choose to see it as a glass, but I could also zoom right down and see it as nothing, not see it at all, because it wouldn't be there. So I guess what I'm getting at is it almost would seem that the world appears because of the restriction in our perceptual and cognitive ability to a very kind of limited band of possibilities. And
So, yeah,
Yeah.
I guess go please. Yes, basically what you're saying is the veiling of Maya. We take particular forms of existence, even though we are this universal sea of consciousness. We are a product of evolution, but we are also evolved. We are also the guiders, the guiding principles of evolution ourselves. So, in terms of the glass, and you said if you look at it really deep down, it will dissolve. It will dissolve probably into superstrings at some point, and then what's beyond the superstrings? Well, in Shaivism, it's a doctrine also of spanda, which means vibration. But the vibration in the Shaivite underlying consciousness is not quite the same thing as the field theory. It's not quite the same thing as quantum field theory. Because there, the vibration of the quantum field, you have a field and it vibrates. Even though it's not material in the usual sense, there's still something there. In the case of these great monistic systems, consciousness itself has the spanda principle, the principle of vibration. But it is a subtle movement. And it is a subtle movement that becomes eventually bigger, and when it gets filtered, and in fact some great teachings that talk about Maya or the veiling principle as essentially like a prism, which takes the white light and makes it into many colors. And in fact, if you look at the tattvas, you will see that at some point the rays, which are different tattvas, are really coming from, let's say, the ego. Most of them come from the ego. Then the analogy is there, but it's an analogy. So it will dissolve ultimately into some sort of vibration of universal consciousness.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, but you did much better in terms of scientific implications. Wasn't it Albert Einstein who was particularly chuffed about actually realization, which he considered to be more important than what he is known for, is that realization that light is exhibits both qualities. Light is both particles and waves. So when Rick was saying the example with the glass, I think it's very important to also understand that the example of zooming in and trying to kind of like go to the bottom, or like let's say the finest layer of what this reality is made of, it's still kind of approaching it a little bit from the old paradigm. Not necessarily that you are coming from that, but that kind of zooming in. Because what really quantum science gives us is understanding that this glass exists here, both as the possibility in consciousness which has collapsed into a particular object in time, in space-time, and it simultaneously also exists as a possibility on a wavelength. And this is where we enter, or where science overlaps with very deep, profound experiences known as yogic experiences, in quotes unquote. And earlier, when you mentioned the science of Matrika, which is very, very unique to Kashmir Shaivism.
The science of what?
Matrika.
Matrika.
Matrika, which is the science of the matrix. Sometimes it's called as the little mother. That literally it's that plethora that contains absolutely everything in its pure potentiality. It's a very profound realization when one actually experiences it directly. But in terms of sort of some of the listeners perhaps will be kind of correlate this, I would like to mention something for which Kashmir Shaivism stands unique in terms of the importance of the sound, right? Like this,
right.
The whole...
Tantra in general.
Yeah, and Tantra in general,
yeah,
exactly. That kind of the emission of sound, or the sea, the ocean of sound.
Yeah.
And the uniqueness also here is with the understanding that the Sanskrit through which the knowledge of Kashmir Shaivism operates, or being conveyed, related, is based on the, not that this is a very, very precise correlation between sound and form, between the essence and form, in other words. This is something that is encapsulated in the term Namarupa, but like that kind of the field of all potentialities, right? That kind of the field, the quantum field. We can say that it's a continuum. So that sound, the first letter of the alphabet, of the Sanskrit alphabet, is A. Yeah, A, like like in terms of how it is written, and the sound that is produced is an uninterrupted sound. Right. So there's the letter A. It actually literally exemplifies that uninterrupted continuum. But soon, as it collapses into the next one, which is Ka or Ksa, sometimes known as, like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, for instance, elaborated on it very beautifully, where, for me personally, it was a beautiful reconciliation and deep understanding of the teaching that existed in Kashmir Shaivism and what Maharishi Mahesh Yogi brought through his science of creative intelligence, where that literally that Vedic verse, Richo Akshare Paramev Yaman, remember that? Mm-hmm. That the one whose vision is open to that field of all potentialities within the gap between the sounds, to him only the reality is known, not the one who repeats the Vedas, so to speak. Right. Mm-hmm. So this is literally Richo Akshare, this from A, that uninterrupted continuum, to K, where the sound collapses from wavelength into something particular. In other words, from that A to Ka, right? Or Ksa, yeah. That literally is the mystery. This is where the mystery has been pointed towards. And I find it terribly exciting because it gives that visceral understanding of how actually the ultimate reality, which is a substratum of all that exists, also simultaneously expresses itself as the infinitude of points of collapse, because it collapses in point in time, but it collapses in infinity, in infinitude of waves of possibilities. In other words, it's like there's no end to that collapse and there's no end to that sound of that open sound. So, the science of matter.
So Igor was speaking about matrika, which is usually translated as little mother or ununderstood mother. What matrika is the energy within sound, and it's in this theory that the world is created out of vibration, out of a deep, very, very subtle vibration called spanda that then becomes more and more concretized. Where it ends up with us, where we end up with it, is language. Because matrika, as we know it, is actually it's the veiling power within language. So, and I just was thinking of an event that happened to a friend of mine many years ago. She was in a car accident, and as you know, car accidents,
it's okay,
are sometimes the triggers for profound experiences of expansion. So she was thrown out of the car on 101 and landed in the median strip, and found herself in this utterly vast plain where there were no forms. She was in a state of complete ecstasy. She didn't know her name or who she was. There was certainly no pain. And little by little, as she tells it, after an infinity of time, suddenly this trickle of words began to come into her mind, and it went like this: I hope they don't think it was my fault. And as soon as those words arose, she was back in her body, in pain, worrying about the outcome of her accident. And she said, and I've experienced this myself, that this was the moment when she understood the veiling power of language. That without it, reality is infinite possibility. As soon as we begin to create names and thoughts and definitions, then reality is particularized and limited and defined. And that's, matrika shakti, as it's called, the power behind language, the power within language, is actually the form of the shakti aspect, the energy aspect of the divine that cuts things constantly into particles and then constantly allows the unveiling to occur so that we can experience wholeness. And it's really a constant rhythmic movement.
And it's very beautiful because obviously that accident was a very beautiful example of direct experience of that very visceral experience, as I can imagine.
Yeah.
And Kashmir Shaivism is very, very specific and goes into a great depth to explain how the language veils reality,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Yeah.
And there is obviously this profound science of the progressive manifestation of sound through its 4 stages,
Yeah.
from para to Pashyanti to Madhyama to the Vaikari, how it actually literally comes from that level of unmanifested level of pure potentiality, whatever we might call it, where Shiva is united with Shakti and indistinguishable
Right.
from the level of para. And then how it is gradually being manifested through its progressively more, let's say, contracted state until it is being expressed as the thought or as the speech.
And simultaneously.
And simultaneously as everything,
Yeah.
absolutely, because
Yeah.
the language is here to be understood not just what we speak orally, but language which collapses literally collapses the wave into something particular, into particles.
Yeah, and one of the teachings of Shaivism that I find really difficult to understand in my normal state of consciousness is that reality is constantly being recreated, in fractional seconds, so that in between any thought, in between any breath, in between any perception, the whole universe collapses back into its non-dual state, into its non-dual form. And we're watching a 24 frame per second movie that is actually a series of stills with stillness between them. This is a realization that I actually have to be in what we normally call an altered state to really grasp, because it's so intuitively ungraspable in our ordinary reality. And I think that's the thing about physics that people like Rick are so fascinated by, because there is actually a physical world explanation of these subtle realities that almost to a modern materialist mind, like all of us have, it kind of explains it in a way we can say, okay, this is a physical thing as well as being this, infinitely subtle reality that's only graspable in high states of meditation and realization. Somebody can do the math.
I have 2 questions. Oh, go ahead.
There's kind of challenges as well that accepted view of creation.
Yes, it does.
Creation, from that perspective, creation never took place.
Yeah.
And that's really the true depth of understanding of the true permanence of pure awareness of the Shiva.
Yeah.
And so that kind of manifestation and the withdrawal, it doesn't happen only in terms of pralaya, not
Right.
only in terms of that Vedic or Tantric concept of time.
Right.
But it is like this continuum that literally it has no beginning and no end. So it's like a stream of consciousness, what I personally like that reference as the stream of consciousness which simply streams within itself
Right.
for its own sake.
Right. Yeah, and infinitely self-recursive. I'm wondering if it would be useful if we kind of did a, kind of textbook explanation of how Kashmir Shaivism sees the world.
Sure.
Is that
I have a couple of questions based on what you guys were just saying. Should I ask those now, or do you want to do your textbook explanation?
Why don't you follow up?
Just kind of get the term, just so we get the.
Well, maybe I can ask my questions, and then you can include the answers in your textbook explanation. One is, you were speaking as though just now language is responsible for the manifestation of creation, and obviously people are going to think, well, wait a minute, if they think of language in the ordinary human sense, the universe was around for probably billions of years before there were any beings who devised languages, and yet so manifestation had already happened. So that question needs to be addressed. And the second thing, what you were just saying about the collapse of the universe in micro moments in between.
Right.
Are you saying that happens for each observer, or are you saying that somehow the entire universe does that in some kind of universal way? And third question to throw in is, there's more, but 3 for now, is just that there's obviously a consistency between observers. We all see this table with 3 glasses on it, and if somebody else comes into the room who hasn't been here today, they'll see the table with 3 glasses on it. So it seems that there's a kind of a template for reality that goes far beyond any individual's perspective on it, and that individuals just sort of tune in on to whatever extent they can. So any notion that somehow we each individually in every moment create the universe would seem to fly in the face of that point.
Well, that I'd like to answer that question first, because Shaivism is really interesting in that there is a creator in Shaivism. In other words, reality is personified in a certain sense, and the basic teaching is that all of this is a manifestation inside one great mind. So, and that one great mind has, it seems, I'm not one with that mind, at least not at this moment. So I can only speak from hearsay.
And yet you are.
And yet I am, exactly. So all of this is occurring inside one mind, and that's the mystery that both Hamid and Dennis were talking about last night, which is that it's all inside one mind, and that mind, it's like if you go in enough, you'll go out and become one with that mind. But all of our atomic minds are aspects of that one mind, which is why there's one reality that we all see.
So we're like little sense organs of one cosmic being.
Yes, we're a prism. We're like, if we say the light has gone through a prism, that the little dots, points of light that are on the other side of the prism are our consciousness, our individual consciousness. But actually, it's one light. So there are all these millions of individual perceivers, but the consciousness that's seeing through them is one, and seeing.
There's only one agent.
There's only one agent.
Light that is one, though the lamps be many. Incredible string band.
Yes. Yes.
Good.
Yes. There's. Anyway, I don't know how to answer your first question.
You have to reiterate it again.
You have to reiterate.
The first question is you were talking about language as the method of manifestation, and superficial understanding of that. One would assume you're talking about human language, but humans weren't around for the first many billion years. Yeah.
Well, it's actually not as complicated as it seems, or not as complicated as it seems in a sense that this very perspective, if we delve deeper into the perspective of these four progressively manifesting levels of sound, from para to vaikari, or let's say para here stands from the one, beyond, or beyond of the beyond, right, the ultimate, to the level of where it is literally manifesting as something, manifesting as sound which literally can be heard. And sound that can be heard, obviously, is the form of that sound condensed as matter. Because everything in the universe, all forms, is just that.
Sound condensed as matter.
Sound, how it is essentially different frequencies. So even in terms of this granite, I hope it is granite, not a fake one, even if this is an Indian granite, so we can imagine the structure, molecular atomic structure, is extremely dense. It is still a sound. It is still a sound condensed and having that hard appearance of matter. So if we take that stand view for a moment. And
let me just clarify something and let you continue. Ordinarily we think of sound as fluctuations in air pressure, which our eardrums can pick up on, and we interpret that as sound. But you're talking about not air as the medium, obviously, but something much more fundamental.
I'm talking about the fundamental, as scientists would use that. In terms of, like, when Menes will come back, we'll ask him to back it up, because this is precisely how scientists use the term sound. Sound is a frequency, and absolutely everything is a frequency, just like everything is energy. For instance, the example of the glass that you have started this discussion with, we could have also looked at it that yes, it's the conglomerate of molecules and atoms, but at the same time it still exhibits the property of energy. And this is why spiritual experiences sometimes meld the so-called, in inverted commas, normal, ordinary perception. The spiritual, the breakthroughs are usually that reality which we perceive through 5 apertures, right? Through the 5 sensory perceptions for which we are equipped with the organs of cognition. which is really the anatomy of the spirit, and yogic and Vedic and tantric spirituality. I mean, the spirituality, let's say, that has evolved and has been transmitted on Indian subcontinent is very unapologetic about this. So, in other words, we can see everything just as energy as well. But we do not perceive necessarily everything as energy until we do. So is in relation to our own, let's say, embodied individuality. This individuality that identifies with the body only perceive this as a matter. This is why we live in time now, this time that we live in, this, let's say, phase in our evolution. The reason why we run into such predicament with everything is because of that temporal eclipse and objectification to a degree where we perceive everything as just that, matter. You see? While at the same time forgetting that there's no such thing as matter. It's a degree of the frequency with which frequency compacts itself into something particular. In Christian spirituality, for instance, right, in Christianity, these are known as dragon, like the vortexes. What are they called? We have here Francis. Maybe he can help.
You know what
us.
he's talking about?
Not that like the vortexes.
Like a whirlpool. What are you saying?
Where the energy itself at the state of the collapse to become something in particular. But I just don't want to go away too much from the first question that you posed in terms of the language and these 4 progressive stages of sound. How come that when human beings, let's say, were not around even, right? Or
Yeah.
there is this also understanding that correlates these 4 progressive levels of sound with the epochs that we live in.
The yugas?
Yugas, different yugas. And these are not to be understood in linear perspective for those who are not familiar with Vedic concept of time or Tantric concept of time. It is concentric rather than linear. So this concentric understanding of time is much more profound compared to, let's say, time in terms of yesterday, now, and tomorrow. It doesn't operate doesn't view reality in that way. It rather views reality in terms of manifestation of certain aspects of consciousness, or in terms of the lacking of certain manifestation on manifested plane. In other words, when there is a loss of information, that's what we know as different yugas. And we know that the Golden Age, for instance, was known for 100% of manifestation of all laws of nature that were even perceptible on the obvious plane of existence. And when there it
By
went
laws of
into the
nature, you
degree
mean
of
devas and so, more refined.
Different levels of subtle beings were perceptible in the.
Exactly.
Yeah, the
In
whole
other words,
the
we
whole
could
picture
say-
was open.
We can even imagine, we can conclude even, that in that state, in time, there was no necessity for language. Because what for? You see, there was no separation. The language arises, and this is historically even, you can find the references that, like the Tower of Babel, or if you want to go to the depth of the Vedic mythology, and you can see that the rise of the language happens somewhere at the break point when, let's say, 50-50, when there's a 50% of laws manifesting on obvious plane, and 50% are simply lost. The Maya, let's say, the density of Maya is that much more.
So are you suggesting that everyone was just telepathic before that or something? No language?
Why not? Everything is in that state.
I'm not saying they weren't. I'm just saying, is that what you're saying?
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Okay.
So essentially, it's the time when perhaps the communication is not necessarily has to happen through this format, but as the diminishing takes place. And by the way, that also linked to the Vedic concept of Dharma. Remember that the Dharma in the Golden Age stands on all 4,
Right.
and then it starts losing its legs.
Right.
In Kali Yuga, Dharma stands on one leg. This is why we all need to prop it. We're all literally holding it together.
Yeah.
This is the sort of, so we live in time when all this necessitates, you see, we have to have spiritual practice, we have to have religious revelations, we have to have language, because otherwise we will simply constantly miscommunicate. And look what happens with the language. Even with the language we can't sit together and talk. Look what happens around the world in the politics and economics.
Sally?
Well, I'm agnostic about the yugas. And it's very interesting that traditional systems believe that this world is gradually, that what's happening is a kind of entropic situation where we started out very subtle and wise, and then we become stupider and stupider as time goes on. Whereas
Cyclically,
right. Whereas, of course, Western view is that we are actually in a progressive situation, evolving towards greater consciousness. I have no idea what is true. I do know that in looking at traditional systems, it's very important to take what, to kind of take what you can really feel internally and is true, and not necessarily accept the aspects of it that are hard to swallow.
Well, it has to be backed up by personal experience.
It has to be backed up by personal experience.
Otherwise it will become very quickly a dogma.
Exactly. And in those moments when you are in a state of very subtle experience, and for example, the insight that you're talking about may sort of display itself before you as a realization, then that's true for you. If it's not true for somebody else, then in a certain sense, it sounds as though you're asked. It's like that line in Alice in Wonderland. Are you asking me to believe in 24 impossible things before breakfast?
Jump with me.
Yeah. So in terms of what is it about Kashmir Shaivism that is really helpful for us today, and I love this understanding and the experience of the subtle worlds, which is, I think for all of us who've done this kind of practice, subtle world experiences are delightful and ecstatic. But to me, what's more important is that you actually can experience the pulsation of divineness, of non-dual sweetness in your own body and in your emotions and in the table and in the interactions, and that will allow you to really understand that God is you, that God is in this, that that everything is contained in this atom of our body, because that's what allows us, to really to evolve to the point that I think all the traditions are asking us to evolve to. And it does involve the thing about Shaivism, and is that it really asks us to fully accept this manifest universe and our own thought streams and our own individual manifestation, to take it as seriously as we take the realms of higher thought.
I'm sorry.
Maybe we could, maybe this is kind of an invitation to introduce a little bit where Kashmir Shaivism itself comes from, sort of like that we give it a little bit of a even historical platform, so that we can depart from it and perhaps go beyond the historical platform.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful.
What Sally just said is very important, because it takes us back to the very core of why we started to discuss this here.
Mm-hmm.
And shall I? Would you like to?
Let me give a little piece of it, and then let's do it like Radio Lab. Where one person says something, somebody else doesn't, so you're not listening to one person sort of droning on. So the way that I explain the Kashmir Shaiva worldview, in the simplest way I know to explain it, is to think of reality as a great, vast, self-recursive I-ness, a consciousness, an agent who is non-dual, has no limits, is totally vast, and who is in this experience of I am, and sort of
self-interaction,
self-recursive, like constantly turning back on itself. And in Shaivism, they say that this self-recursive oneness, this I amness, has the quality of consciousness and bliss, awareness and bliss. And they give it the name Shiva for the awareness part and Shakti for the bliss part. And they say that inside the Shakti, the bliss of consciousness is powers of will, knowledge, and action. Menas was talking about it last night. And that in the process of manifesting universes within itself, the Shakti aspect of supreme consciousness actually creates all the multiverses within her own body, on her own screen, out of perfect freedom as play. And that's the fundamental idea of Kashmir Shaiva Tantra. All of this is constantly being manifested in the great mind of consciousness, which in the Sanskrit is given a feminine form. So it's the feminine aspect, which is why I call my workshops the feminine path. It's a so-called feminine, because of course we're beyond gender here, aspect of consciousness that is making everything within itself. And that the idea in Shaivism is that that the ultimate is completely present. It's a holographic model. The ultimate is completely present in every atom of the universe. You know, just the way the whole holographic picture is present in every fragment of it. So that understanding, that overall understanding, which I think is which is the as above, so below, as here, so elsewhere recognition, is then there's then a very specific process of this ultimate reality manifesting through stages called tattvas, which means essence. You know, so that that very subtle vastness becomes more and more particular, and that vast consciousness becomes an individual consciousness, and then a mind and ego and the physical world, but always with the understanding that the whole is in the atom. So and the idea that the individual consciousness is, as one of my friends calls it, baby-faced God. So the whole process, the whole tradition is really there for showing us, and it does it very specifically, how your consciousness could be the same as the vastness. You know, of course it is and it isn't, but ultimately it is.
Essentially it is.
Essentially it is, and it's a tradition that's really all about helping you get that. You know, it's a practice-based tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So whether or not the tattvas actually look like that, like they say in the charts, which were obviously seen in meditation by some sages, but
And the tattvas are?
tattvas are the stages of the manifestation of that consciousness into this consciousness and into this body, and into the. But the thing that Shaivism says that's so interesting is that creation is from the inside out. So in other words, their position is that the individual consciousness comes first, and then the world that's experienced. And that, of course, does not jibe with the Western theory of evolution, or the belief that perhaps the truth that this physical universe started with the Big Bang, and that human individuated consciousness came much later.
You just said, so the individual consciousness comes first, and then the creation. I would have said consciousness comes first, and then creation. But individual consciousness.
Well, in other words, what I understand Shaivism to say is that the observer, the individual observer, is prior to what is observed, and that's, you know, in other words, this universe, this physical universe, exists to be experienced by the conscious observer.
There is a term, very succulent term, universal egoity.
Universal egoity.
Universal egoity, which is unique, by the way.
Yeah.
To Kashmir Shaivism, unique because many people, when they misunderstand or understand that only to a certain measure, that creates a lot of perplexed, if not confused, kind of ideas, because what it really means is that essentially there is nothing but Shiva, and the very expositions, Shiva here is a pure awareness.
Right.
Nothing but the absolute. There's nothing but that totality. And not only that, a notion of universal egoity, which Sally was just very beautifully explained through like individual consciousness, because it's always individual consciousness. It's always with one reference only.
Even if
It
it's
is
a
in reference to
universal
its own self.
individual.
Yes.
Yes.
Because it may have to
In
be
other words,
before there are any
exactly.
Yes.
you know,
In other
little
words,
biological entities around it.
Kashmir Shaivism does
Exactly.
not accept the notion of nothingness. It actually criticizes it.
Mhm.
Every sage that came did its best to actually dismantle and show the weak side of the understanding of nothingness.
Mhm.
So that ever since the, let's say, the arisal of the Kashmir Shaivism on the stage as a unique system, right, as a unique, with its very, very concisely formulated doctrines, there was this understanding of the universal egoity. And in fact, the term for Shiva is Anuttara. Right? It's also like Anu is an atom.
Yeah.
You know, so Anuttara is like an atom. You know, it has the same root. Anu stands for
The ultimate atom.
the ultimate
Anuttara,
atom. So
yeah.
the smallest of the small, in other words. This is very important. It's like the very fabric of this consciousness, out of which everything is woven, is Shiva. And there is another very supporting also sloka which comes through some of the scriptures, is that even the bhumi, the earth tattva, the earth element, which is considered to be the manifestation of this world, the most grossest, isn't it? It's the densest element, is Shiva. Literally, it states that. In other words,
Yeah.
it's a completely different perspective of appearance in consciousness, the Vedantic, right? The Advaitic Vedantic concept of this world is an appearance in consciousness. In Kashmir Shaivism, instead, views this reality as reality itself, beholding itself through the multitude of form and phenomena for its own glory. In other words, it cannot help it but to admire itself. But in order to do that, it needs to be, literally, it needs to break to the infinitude of forms so that it can have as many angles as it can to behold its magnificence. So this is one of the central points in Kashmir Shaivism, is that the universal egoity. In other words, there's no such thing as Rick's, Sally's, or Igor's, or anyone else's ego. There's no such thing as individual ego to start with. This is a very radical understanding, very radical understanding. This is on which Kashmir Shaivism operates, that there is only agency, which is, there's only one agent, and that agent is pure awareness, Shiva, who exemplifies here that archetypal quality of masculine spirit, right? Erected spirit. But Shakti is Shiva in its form, as manifestation, as dynamic powers of Shiva. So it's like that universal egoity is a very important aspect which aimed at showing through a very, very concise discourses and expositions that there is no even such thing as to consider yourself to be somehow this limited individual. That limited individual doesn't even belong to the limited individual. That limited individual is Shiva in disguise.
Yeah.
That's the beauty of the Kashmir Shaivism.
It's helpful to understand that there's a Shaiva paradigm which says that this consciousness, this absolute consciousness, exists at three levels with three different capacities for perception. So at the ultimate level, I-ness is the pure I am, Shiva Shakti, where there is no form, everything is within itself, everything is potential. There's absolute freedom of will, knowledge, and action, total bliss, total perfection, total consciousness. And then once once there has been the refraction through Maya, once there has been the veiling, what remains is consciousness, which is pure awareness, but has it has lost its capacities. In other words, it no longer is all powerful, no longer all pervasive. It's a limited consciousness. It's Rick's consciousness. It's the place you get to in Buddhist, in self-inquiry. When you go past the mind, you go through the mind, you go past the body, and you realize that you are pure consciousness, but it's a limited consciousness at that point, because its powers have been taken from it by Maya. And then the third level is the level of I am ahamkara, the ego level of consciousness, where you're totally identified with your mind, your body, your personal history. And it's interesting to recognize that pure consciousness, as we mostly understand it in spiritual practice today, is not the ultimate consciousness. The ultimate consciousness is, has been freed from the veiling and is actually able to experience itself or herself or himself as all that is and beyond. So it's always an interesting question to ask yourself, okay, who is my I now? Is this my ego I identified with as Sally? Is this the pure awareness that is free from the body, mind, or am I actually experiencing myself as all that is at this moment? And what Shaivism says is that you cannot regard yourself as a true non-dualist if you're not actually experiencing this entire universe as a part of your own being, as a part of your own body. So it's a very very, very expansive understanding of what the I is.
In other words, it also takes one back in the aspirant of consciousness to that necessarily separation where the self have to be separated from the non-self, so that because it shares a lot with
Vedanta. Yeah.
So yeah, in terms of the what is the primary I consciousness. Very practically, we experience it every day, but we don't pay attention to it. It is the perfect I awareness, which at the so-called pure levels of Shaivism, and it's pure and impure, doesn't really have a connotation of good or bad. We don't want to go that way. But more has to do with unlimited versus limited, or unlimited, totally unlimited, then partially limited, and then totally limited. At the unlimited level, basically you can have 5 levels of the I-ness. And the first 2 levels really are considered one. It's the Paramashiva and Parashakti, or the Supreme Self, that is not separate from the infinite powers that it has. And Shakti, Parashakti, or Chitti, as sometimes she's referred to, they are the same. It's really like a one coin, or a coin that has only one side. If we think of the coin, we say, well, a coin is part of the coin, both sides. But actually, this magic coin has both sides are in one side. So there's really no difference between them. The I and that don't even exist yet in the mind of universal consciousness. But then there is a slight vibration, beginning vibration, which happens with the first and maybe the most fundamental power, which is the power of will, universal will. And then following the universal will is the power, and I say then, of course, that again it's a linear thing, it's not linear at all. But let's say subsequent to that, in the sense of emergent from it, is the power to know, the Jnana Shakti. First one is called Icha Shakti. And then the third one is the Karma Shakti, the ability to do
Kriya Shakti.
Kriya Shakti, the ability to do whatever universal consciousness wants to do, and eventually becomes bound, and Kriya Shakti becomes karma, or karmic consequences. But at that pure level, those 5 levels, you can consider them as 4 levels, you can consider them as 3 levels, doesn't really matter, that's so much numerology. But there's just one I awareness, and it's just the steering. This is again the idea of spanda, the steering of vibration, that the universe begins to manifest as an idea, but not an idea in a human sense, but a concept in a universal mind. And the first steering of that universal consciousness is the self-awareness. And that's where, in fact, then you're referring to the 2 letters a little while ago, Sanskrit alphabet, which eventually, of course, gets you down to Earth, to the Earth level. The steering of consciousness goes through this, happens through these three principles, or universal powers. Of course, the infinite has infinite powers, but for our ways of categorizing, we say it is the power to will something, is the power to know something, and then is the power to act on that something or in relationship to that something. That something, in this particular case, eventually becomes a universe, or maybe becomes many universes. In fact, becomes probably infinite universes. But at first, the first steering is the self-awareness, the pure I awareness, and then once you have that, then it's beginning of the division, but not happened yet, of that. So the I am that is really the I and that are the same at the beginning. In fact, there's no am. The am is a verb that we just add there to make sense of the English or some of the other languages. But it's really I and that are one. The aham and the idam are the same. And then there's the steering, and there's a beginning to separate, and you can do that with the circles. So the first level, where the manifestation begins to take place, you have the I dominates. So really at that level of the willpower, it's the will, I can know everything, or I am about to project everything. And then in the subsequent level, that dominates. And that is, oh, okay, I know the universe is about to manifest, so I begin. And then at the Kriya level, the two are balanced together. And the I and the that are totally balanced. And then below that, and again, below and above, are special ideas that don't really apply in a strict sense, but it is a way for us to convey what's going on. Then the great veiling power materializes, quote unquote, or becomes apparent and veils with the 5 cloaks called Kanchukas. She veils the powers of the Lord. And it is the cosmic prism that then gives rise to time, space, limits. So time gives limits eternality, space limits omnipresence. Then you have limiting of the will. So as a human being, as Sally said, then we have a limited ability to do some things, but not everything. Limited ability to know some things, and that becomes eventually becomes limited knowledge. And then limited ability to do things, which eventually gets us into karma. It gets into actions and reactions and consequences of our actions.
And I think I want to emphasize, if my understanding is correct, that you're not talking about this process of manifestation in some kind of chronological, historical sense,
exactly.
of billions of years ago. You're talking about it happening continuously right now.
It happens everywhere.
Yeah.
It happens in no time. And in fact, they say the blink of the eye, but even the blink of the eye is a fraction of a second. There's no time, there's no space.
It's just an ongoing bubbling up of creation from through all those levels that you just described.
Are we allowed to speak from direct experience? Because
Why not?
Sometimes
Sure.
about Buddha the Gaspar, there's this.
Is he allowed to? Any rules here? No? Okay.
No, because this is
Limited time.
just to kind of like maybe to illustrate what Melis just beautifully elaborated upon. And I did mention that in our first interview, towards the very end. That manifestation, that let's say that the manifestation of known as Shakti in its triadic form, Shiva's triadic form, doesn't make any difference because, as you said, it's one at that stage. But as it breaks out into that which is known as simply as that will, knowledge, and action, is actually directly experientially experienced, and gives us the understanding that what traditions operates is not some kind of imagined symbols, some kind of symbols that simply are archetypally introduced to illustrate that doctrine or that philosophy. It is actually experientially available It is that triangle, that equilateral, which at first experienced as a breakthrough to which you simply perceive in yourself, out of which a tremendous amount of light pours out. So when you said that when you were, in order for anything to appear, there has to be a will and the knowledge of how and the action to follow up with.
Right.
And I'm really happy because you immediately added, but that does not happen in terms of sequence. Like, it's not first, second. It literally happens all at once, and that was direct experience that I was relating in that interview, is that you actually become that triangle, equilateral, pure equilateral, and then your consciousness literally withdrawn into that equilateral, then equilateral itself is losing its space, and the universe from there on is simply proceeds upon from your own being. This is why the direct realization of one's Shiva's nature is that universe is not created, sustained, and dissolved. It literally comes out of my own being. And at some point you even ask me, but you ask me, but you're not presupposing here that it's coming out of you as Igor, to which I was not able to reply to because there was no such thing. At that stage, there was the dissolution take place fully. It first became this primordial energies, the energy of that will, knowledge, and action, and then the withdrawal of these energies into pure consciousness itself, where the universe is literally being pouring out in billions of universes per fraction of a second. Of course, it's like now it is being dressed into language, but when it was actually an ongoing experience, it was something which is very hard to convey because it goes beyond the language, simply becomes a limitation. But I thought to illustrate that because this is so that these philosophies, these doctrines and these practices are not found on some kind of rational understanding of reality, but it is experienced directly. And then, like as all yogas, is the verification of the knowledge through direct experience, through direct partaking.
So we had to move outside. We were taping the first part of this in the hotel bar, and the bar needs to open. So now we're out on the patio. But we have about 15 minutes in which we'd like to conclude this conversation. And I'd like to start these 15 minutes by asking a question that's similar to the one I asked in the beginning, but brings in a different element. And that is the element of it. That is the element of surprise and intelligence. And that is that it seems to me, it would surprise me, it does surprise me, that any scientist could be an atheist, because science is looking at something that is so incredibly awe-inspiring and marvelous, and there's such vast complexity within a single cell, within a single molecule. There are laws of nature that are so brilliantly functioning and coordinated with one another that it seems to me it's like God is staring them in the face. And so I'd like to just sort of play a bit with what Kashmir Shaivism or all of us in general might have to say about the divinity that seems to pervade everything and orchestrate everything.
Well, let me just make a comment about scientists being atheists. Not all scientists are
no, I didn't mean to say all were.
But they are minority. Well, maybe they're majority. Who knows? I mean, there's really no... Here we go.
Hey, put the sign down. Don't worry about the signs. Keep going. All that was divinely orchestrated.
Right. So, what is the prevailing point of view among scientists? I have no idea, but certainly there's vocal minorities, let's put it that way, that they are the militant atheists who take it upon themselves to correct, the wrong thinking among the public, and more or less acting like the old Inquisition, except they're not burning people at the stake. They would like, though, to take away funding and close down departments that dare to cross the boundaries. You're right. I mean, look, the great founders of quantum theory, they all had this profound understanding of the divine, and they talked about it, maybe not in the Western terms of God, although quite often they would use that, or made the coat of arms for his family the yin and yang sign. And of course, Planck said that science takes us to the edge of the ego and then leaves us there. And what's that? So they're all talking about the divine presence. I would say that what is going on many times with these atheist ideas is to try to preserve particular positions, funding, and maybe PR and all of that, books, writing books and all of that stuff. But indeed, if you delve into the deep parts of reality, science is not really different from the great traditions, humanistic traditions. And when scientists say there's only one reality, well, after all, that's what Shaivism says. It's just, again, different ways of expressing the same thing. So I agree with you, yeah.
So what do you have to say about the intelligence that seems to be just saturating every iota of creation and orchestrating its function?
I'd like to say one other thing about the God idea. You know, I do believe that part of the problem is that we have such a, you know, we tend to associate, modern people tend to associate God with what's sometimes called the mythic God. In other words, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Joseph, or the, you know, Shiva with his dreadlocks and snake around his neck, and it's really important to you know, to understand that God is another name for reality,
right,
or God is another name for cosmic intelligence, and that in that sense it seems like there are more scientists who are not militant atheists than you would ordinarily think.
Right.
But God is a hard word for modern people.
Yeah, it is.
It's almost, you know, it's like, I often feel when I'm teaching that I have to get people's permission to say God.
Yeah.
You know, and so often we go, okay, so reality, the Tao, absolute consciousness, you know,
Right.
whatever name you want to give it. So the thing about a tradition like Shaivism or Kabbalah, for example, which is so much like Shaivism, the Jewish mystical tradition, is that they exist within a traditional framework where, you know, where the story, the God story, is accepted by everybody. So people use it as a kind of a shorthand.
Right.
And my guru used to say, Shiva is not Shiva's not a Hindu deity. Shiva is this crystalline divine intelligence,
Right.
this consciousness at the heart of everything. And what I think is very beautiful is to realize the both and. In other words, yes, it's this divine intelligence. It's completely impersonal. It's inside everything, but it's also as personal in a, you know, as a subtle you know, reality in form at that level of consciousness as it is in you and me, you know, on a physical level of consciousness, and that what the traditions let us do is hold those two perspectives.
Correct.
Yeah.
There is no God outside of me.
There's no God outside of me. Yeah.
God.
Yeah.
Me
Yeah.
and God are reunited in that. The
Yeah.
realization and
Yeah.
affirmation.
Speak a little louder.
There is no God outside of me, and there is no me outside of God.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right.
In
Yeah.
other words, if someone wants to have that immediate sense of what God is or what God is not,
Yeah, I guess another way of putting it is, God is in everything and everything is in God.
well,
Or is that a different statement?
there is no God outside of me,
Mm-hmm.
and there is no me outside of God.
Right.
It's a kind of a double affirmation.
Yeah.
It leaves you nowhere but in God, and leaves God nowhere but in you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very, very comforting realization. Very comforting realization, even now, even if it only takes place on that level of mental realization, it's still valid. It is still valid. Because what it does, it creates this way, it creates this possibility that what is the ultimate, what is indestructible, because it simply doesn't come into existence and doesn't come out of existence. It's existence itself. Existence flows out of that and being re-emerged back into that, which gives birth, which sustains and dissolves it all. And that is nowhere but in me. And that is also answer, that me is nowhere but in that.
And the thing that's so subtle about it is to realize that when you say I am that or I am Shiva, that you're not talking about ego on the egoic level. Yeah, and yet you are. So that's the subtlety that has to be realized, right? That
Yes, it's a devastating realization.
It's yes. You have. In other words, the ego does have to die in order to realize that you are that all-encompassing reality. And so Shaivism is often, and Tantra itself is often seen as, people often take it to sort of inflate the personal ego.
Right.
Because if you're saying I am that, often at a certain level you're going, I am that. But it's not an inflation. It's not to inflate yourself.
Yeah.
And that's why it's a matter of realization.
Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life."
Exactly.
Got into trouble for that. And there was a Sufi saint, I forget his name, who said,
Mastur Mastani.
"Is that the guy who was dismembered on the public square for saying I am God?" And he wouldn't stop saying it even as they were dismembering him.
What Sally just said, I want to go back to that because this is very important. It's tremendously important because it's so subtle. Because the realization there is no me outside of the God, and there is no God outside of me. The realization, it's actually happened simultaneously on so many levels, and unless it sacrifices immediately the separate existence of myself from the lower case, then it's not real realization. Because this is what really, the subtlety of that. In other words, when the aperture of that, whatever that, focal point suddenly opens up, you realize that as an aperture you do not exist. You do not exist as this aperture outside of that who you are. And that is what Kashmir Shaivism is so really succulent about. Yeah. It's the realization of the utter magnanimity of your nature. But it's a devastating realization because it's always at the cost of the annihilation of that which you considered yourself to be. And as the Kashmir Shaiva scriptures speak about that, and even that also followed by the realization that you have never been ignorant, because that only belongs to the play, or belongs to that contraction and expansion within the Shiva, within the heart of Shiva, as Spanda. So this is also a very humble realization, very, very humble realization that there is no such thing like, neither prior to realization, no post-realization.
So what perhaps, Shaivism is a complete system, so we can really add to it, and that's not really a purpose here. In terms of making sense or bringing it to the, let's say, the quantum level, or to everyday life, some ways perhaps can be added to the understanding some of these principles, generalized principles. And this principle of complementarity that we've been talking about, it's also highly misunderstood in scientific terms. It was proposed by Niels Bohr, and today mostly it's ignored because it's just philosophy. It doesn't really matter very much. But actually, it matters a lot, and it is one of the ways that universal consciousness manifests the universe at every level, from the very, very top, so-called top level. In terms of the opposites are not really opposites, but they're complementing each other. And that's why Bohr adopted the yin and yang symbol. The yin does not exist without the yang. They're together. They're
intertwined.
Yeah. So complementarity, recursion, which as here so elsewhere, which is also in the Shiva Sutras. And the third one is the creative interactivity or sentience, which is really the Ananda part. It's the bliss of the self which gives rise to everything because of this juxtaposition of the I and the that, which comes out of the love, right? These three principles apply at every level. And they're very scientific. And one has to contemplate them because complementarity again can be dismissed as well. You're just talking about opposites. No, it's not about opposites. It's about how the opposites merge into each other, but they're also separate in some ways from another point of view. So as you were saying, the individual and cosmic consciousness, they are the same, but not in the same. They merge together, but not at the same time. They have a separate existence, depending on where you view it from. So in terms of going back to the word God, I tend generally to also avoid it because it comes with a lot of baggage.
Yeah.
And nowadays, I have to tell you, consciousness is becoming a word with too much baggage.
Yeah, really.
I'm now beginning to say, forget that.
Right.
I'm now shifting more to awareness.
Yeah.
And actually,
Yeah.
I prefer to use the Sanskrit terms for consciousness. There's so many beautiful terms. Why not use them? You know,
exactly.
Chitti, Shakti, Kundalini. On and on and on.
And they vibrate so much.
And Spanda. They're all of these different names of consciousness. Consciousness today has become another word like God.
And nobody knows what it means anyway. Everybody
That's
has
right.
so many disagreements.
Well, most of these disagreements are really about what it means. And, the scientists and philosophers are arguing ad infinitum about consciousness. They're really talking past each other. They're not talking about the same thing.
Can I just add to what Manas very beautifully now expanded upon, that the polarities, that they're not the opposites, that one contains in the other, and one cannot exist without the other. Shiva is as good as dead, as the tantric tradition goes, unless he is accompanied by Shakti as his own manifestation, as everything, as energy, as the world, and so forth. So in terms of our personal experience, upon the realization and upon the integrative phases which are necessarily accompany this process, when we necessarily return to that consciousness, which is the mundane, so to speak, consciousness of our reality, to deal and interact, right? Because we cannot be in Shiva's consciousness all the time. This body will simply not exist, and the Kashmir Shaiva scriptures are quite unapologetic about that. So we have to go back. It's because that within that is a mercy of Shiva itself upon that form. But we return with a very qualitatively different realization. So in other words, our individuality that becomes sacred, because it went through that sacred act of realizing who we are in essence. And then there's the second aha realization that even that individuality also is very sacred. That individuality becomes sacred because it's another form of Shiva. It's an aspect of Shiva in its contracted state as something that can behold Shiva through that multitude of, let's say, expressions.
Beautiful, beautiful. I actually wanted to add one more piece before.
Yeah, I'd like you to speak last because these two have just said a bunch of stuff. So why don't you make some concluding remarks?
I actually was going to talk about the factor in Kashmir Shaivism that is so incredibly significant as an aspect of our own spiritual capacity, which is the understanding that because Shakti has veiled everything, Shakti has to remove the veil. So in other words, you can't. It is literally impossible as an individual to realize the truth, no matter how much effort we make, no matter how smart we are, no matter how much practice we do. We can only take ourselves up to a certain point. And beyond that, it is really the will of Shakti, the will of Shiva, that gives us the capacity to see through the veil. And that's the thing that, that's the ineluctable reality that makes it so difficult for the modern, non-devotional mind to get. Because normally the way that unveiling happens is through the arousing of a kind of combination of love and knowledge. And the love is very much a part of it. So in other words, the experience of having the veil removed is an experience of kind of opening up to the vulnerable, love-saturated, Shakti-infused quality of grace in the individual's life. Without that, knowledge is just knowledge. It doesn't move you through the veil. It drives you. Yeah. Even, and even your realization without that aspect
doesn't transform you ultimately. And I think that in the understanding of non-duality, which is, which all of us have found such a profound basis for conversation and community, it's really very important to understand that non-duality is just a concept without grace, without that gift of connectedness between the individual and the divine, both within and without. So I just wanted to close with a salutation to Shakti, who veils and reveals, to the power of the 5 powers of the divine, which include concealment, that is the absolute hiding of the face of the divine, and the revelation of its presence, which hopefully is really the outcome of this conference and this conversation for all of us.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I'll make my concluding remarks much shorter than usual. Thank you all for participating in this. And those who have made it this far through the conversation, please go to batgap.com and enjoy.